everybody to our November Climate Cafe with Democrats Abroad. Uh, Today marks our annual COP recap. This is COP30, which has been just taking place in Belém, Brazil. It just closed day before yesterday, and we're delighted to have all of you to parse through the success and failures and drama that took place over the last 2 weeks. I'm Dana Freeling, the chair of Democrats Abroad Environment and Climate Crisis Council. Welcome to all of you. This is the first year in many years and perhaps ever that the United States has had no presence whatsoever, no official presence whatsoever in the COP proceedings, for better or for worse. Of course, there were over 100 representatives from the United States representing the United States, but not at the federal level. We had Governor Newsom, we had senators and mayors and governors. It was a nice reflection of some support from the United States, but this was a unique situation. I'm so happy to welcome Larry Moffett, who's on our steering committee, who has just returned, as well as Sam Goodman. Larry is calling in from Belgium, where he runs or participates in a climate NGO called Climate Rising, and Sam Goodman, who is just returned back to Colombia from Belém and was also there in the capacity of a nonprofit. I'd like to open the discussion up. Normally we have a general presentation, but today as a recap, I would really like to open the discussion up to questions and comments of those who have been following the procedure and some feedback from Sam and Larry, who have just returned from the venue. Maybe we can let Sam start us off on his impressions. What do you think were there any successes? Let's just start with the positive. Were there any successes at this year's COP, in your opinion?
I guess I wasn't following the negotiations specifically this year. So in the past, I typically would follow the loss and damage, other types of negotiations. But this year, I was focused more on our side events and the work. So it was more just gathering the information as it came in. Yeah, I think having an agreement and trying to set a roadmap forward on the fossil fuels, I think civil society was happy getting the just transition mechanism. So I suppose there were some wins. Some countries released some NDCs, which showed adequate steps forward, the nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement. And I guess, maybe you could consider that countries reaching an agreement when multilateralism is under threat, you could call that a success. To me, the failures were outweighed by the successes, but yeah, it wasn't a total failure. Also, the referencing of the tripling the adaptation finance, that was important, especially for an adaptation implementation COP. But I think if you don't mention fossil fuels in the actual text, and then I think overriding Colombia in the closing plenary was just unbelievably egregious. And you can ask yourself, which countries would they override or pretend not to see their objections? But yeah, I don't think it was a total failure. I think it was weak. I think COPs are still relevant, even if the results are slower than expected. And I think having some sort of multilateral cooperation is obviously important. And I think the $6.5 billion pledged to the TFFF was important as well. So it wasn't, yeah, I wouldn't like qualify it as a complete failure. But I do think there were plenty of issues to be addressed going forward.
I have understood that there really wasn't a roadmap. There was always talk about a roadmap to transition away from fossil fuels, but there was no roadmap actually produced
Not
or
in the text, but I mean, there was the discussions afterwards about that. So
and will Colombia be leading the way? I understand that there's going to be some follow-up meetings in Colombia.
the what's it called? It was announced at the end of April next year. The other one in Colombia will be co-hosting the what's it called? I think Larry probably knows more about that than I do. In Santa Marta, Colombia, the um
I,
the
I
Just
think
Transition
it's
Away from Fossil Fuels conference. So it's the first international conference on this being hosted in Santa Marta, Colombia.
Well, we'll look forward to you keeping us up to date there since you're already there on the ground. But most of the reports and discussion that I've engaged in has criticized a lack of concrete roadmap, transitioning away from fossil fuels, and the fact that even in Dubai in COP28, fossil fuels were mentioned and the need to transition away, and that language was just scrubbed from this year's COP. What are the implications of that? I think everyone there agrees and understands what the detrimental impact of fossil fuels, accounting for 70% of our emissions, and that they dare not even mention them or really lay out a concrete pathway to getting the planet, alleviating our addiction.
Yeah, and just on the roadmaps, so after the not in the multi-lateral decision, but the COP president created the two said that he would create two roadmaps, one on halting reversing deforestation, the other on transitioning away from fossil fuels in a just, orderly, and equitable manner. So they said that they would create this, but it wasn't included in the actual text, I think.
Okay, so it's
But
a
I could be
promise
wrong.
yet to
Yeah.
be kept, but it will be.
Two roadmaps were announced, but outside the actual cover decision, I think.
So this was the other criticism, or one of the other major criticism is that there was too little emphasis on deforestation. There were many criticisms. I mean, I'm not sure there has been such a controversial COP in many years, but it may have felt different um, there in the place. Larry, in here somewhere. Larry, what were your impressions of the most positive outcomes of this? Is Larry still here?
yeah. My laptop. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. My laptop, the Wi-Fi, the airport Wi-Fi, conked out. So now I'm on my phone. And
So
so
you
I
literally
missed.
are en route back.
Yes. I'm in a stopover. It's in the city of Recife. Waiting for my overnight flight back. Uh, so I may repeat some of what Sam said because I missed part of it. But um, every COP I've been to, there's always those who say that it was a complete failure, those who say that it was a success, those who say it was somewhere in between. I try to tend to look at the more positive aspects. My colleagues from Belgian NGOs, Greenpeace, Oxfam, etc. They follow the negotiations very closely. They lobby the Belgian negotiators, and they came away really very happy about the just transition mechanism. So before this COP, we had something called the Just Transition Work Program, and without getting into the thick weeds of COP, jargon, a mechanism is something much more powerful, more significant than just a work program. So during the COP, the activists were all calling for a what they called the BAM, the Belém Action Mechanism, and that was all about just transition and respecting, human rights and workers' rights and gender rights, and so I think what ultimately came out was called the Just Transition Mechanism, and that is seen as a real breakthrough. On the other hand, on fossil fuels, it's obviously very disappointing that not even the words could be included. They were not included in COP29. Now they're not included in COP30. But I think what you can sort of try to find something positive in that is the roadmaps and the Belém Declaration from Colombia are basically a recognition that the consensus-based process just doesn't work, because you will always have some petrostate blocking any progress on fossil fuels. So that now finally opens the door to a process that will be sort of parallel with the COP, with the UNFCCC. Now, my citizen movement, Rise for Climate. Sorry?
With a coalition of the willing?
Yes, exactly.
So President Lula, in his opening address, President Lula of Brazil said that this would be the COP of implementation, that the previous COPs have been COPs of promises and vows of, what they were going to do. And that he promised that this would be the COP of implementation. Do you think that that this promise was fulfilled?
No, not really. No. Clearly, there's not much implementation. There's some slight progress on adaptation finance. Last year and the year before was most. Well, that to me is not quite. Yeah, that's not quite clear to me, because I had read that the EU had, after much resistance, had finally agreed to go from doubling, which was what was previously agreed, to tripling. But then the wording seems very vague. It's like doubling with a view to tripling, or something like that. So typical, very ambiguous diplomatic language. And also, I think it's been reaching that target of tripling would be postponed from 2030 to 2035. But anyway, at least the EU, in the absence of the US, I think the EU is considered sort of the leader of the global north. And so, everyone was sort of looking at the EU, and anything that was sort of blocking from the global north, it was the EU being blamed for it. Yeah, so that's some progress on adaptation, because that clearly was a huge demand from developing countries, and that's also one of the reasons why many developing countries were against the reference to transition away from fossil fuels. It was sort of like bargaining, saying, look, if you don't give us money for adaptation, why should we give up on our fossil fuels, which is an economic resource that we can use to pay for our adaptation, since if you're not going to help us pay for it. So that was kind of the horse trading that was going on, I think, behind closed doors. Just wanted to say again about the fossil fuels is that my movement, Rise for Climate, we've been supporting the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Which is in the Democrat platform also.
Exactly, yes. Yes. And so before COP, 17 countries had signed on to this treaty. It's not really a treaty yet. It's a proposal for a treaty.
Colombia
and this
included.
proposal, sorry?
Colombia included, of course.
Yes, Colombia, exactly. Colombia really clearly, once again, showing fantastic leadership on this, being the first country that is not an island nation, and also being a fossil fuel producer. But one more country joined during COP30, and I was there at the event where the Cambodian ambassador stood up and said that Cambodia was supporting. So that's the 18th country. No European country has yet signed up to it, but tomorrow there will be a hearing at the Belgian Federal Parliament on a resolution that the Green parties of Belgium have supporting this fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. And so one of my colleagues from Rise for Climate, one of the co-founders, will be there. Also, the European Director of Advocacy and Campaigns from the treaty. He's going to be virtually from Paris. And Sandrine Dixon de Cleve, who used to be a member of Democrats Abroad Belgium, or I guess she still is, but who has been co-president of the Club of Rome and been really a very well-known speaker at many conferences. So she will be joining as well, and we hope that will give us some weight, to defend and support this resolution. I don't think the chances of...
It's excellent news, and I hope you keep us posted.
Well, yeah, I honestly, I think the chances are fairly slim that it'll pass because we do have a fairly right-wing parliament, but at least it gives us a chance to present it.
To have a voice at the table, and it's important that at least the voices are heard, that they have a seat at the table to be heard. Which brings me to another issue, which would love your feedback on that there were. If you look at my backdrop, my Zoom backdrop, you'll see some of the indigenous peoples that were protesting out of the COP. I think they even broke into the blue zone and were disrupted, had to be ushered out by police. What was your take on these, the need for them, the presence of them, the impact of them? Sam, would you like to give your impressions? And
yeah, I mean, there was definitely more conspicuous presence than any other COP, and it gave a unique feel. I mean, whether their voices were really included in the actual negotiations, I think is up for debate at the very least. I think the blue zone representation, I saw some numbers that showed like low blue zone representation, which is obviously unfortunate. When you went to the green zone, it was very different. It felt like it was almost 50-50 indigenous population, which was nice to see. Unfortunately, I didn't get to spend a lot of time at the green zone, and then outside saw the protesters. I wasn't in the venue when the incident occurred, but I mean, you can understand the level of frustration given Brazil's history in particular and the state of the negotiation. So there's it was understandable. And then there was the iconic moment where like the COP president Andre was holding the indigenous baby when they're holding it. Then there's a lot of pushback with civil society because there was the increasing militarization of the actual COP, um, which seemed to increase following the incident. I don't know. I felt like that the Brazil government was kind of between a rock and a hard place in some ways because I mean, the incident did get somewhat violent, so it's just, I mean, it's an uncomfortable situation, but I think it should be uncomfortable. And I was mainly focused on like the side events I was on, so it wasn't really super involved in the cop narrative. So I think I can't really speak too much beyond, what was in the news and what my, broad oversight were.
Larry, what were your impressions?
Well, to be honest, I was expecting more of a formal presence by the indigenous representatives, because at previous COPs, I have seen them there in their typical costumes, and yes, there were surely more of them this year, but not. I didn't. I mean, just for example, along the walls of this very long corridor leading to all the various meeting rooms, there were these giant photographs of Amazon wildlife, but not a single photo of an indigenous person. And you really had to go outside the COP. I had the chance to go visit the Amazon Museum, which has just recently opened in Belém, and they have an exhibition of photographs from the photographer, Portuguese, I guess, Sebastian Salgado. Anyway, beautiful photographs of the Amazon jungle, forest, rainforest, and of its people. And you really see the incredible diversity. I mean, one sort of thinks of the Amazon as just being one big rainforest, but it's the variety, the biodiversity, but also the number of different indigenous peoples with their own traditions, their own ways of life, their own languages and everything. And many of these tribes are down to just a few hundred or a couple of thousand people. They've just been decimated. And now, of course, their livelihood is at risk from deforestation, from mining, from their waters being contaminated. So I just felt that could have been much more visible and presented at the in the blue zone.
Yeah, it's surprising. The indigenous people there, and they are very broad in their diversity, are the guardians of the Amazon and of the forest. And of course, we know the forests are the Amazonian forests are the lungs of the planet. So what could be more important than their presence and their voice at the table? And it is sad that their exposure and their images seem to be repressed within the negotiating process. I know that in the past and many COPs, yes, there are token indigenous people that are brought there, that are included, but this was an opportunity meant to be an opportunity. This is why it was held in the Amazon, so that this would facilitate the real participation of the indigenous people, of the people in frontline vulnerable communities, to have a voice at the table. It seems that this was not a successful aspect of the COP. I see Naomi has her hand up. Would you like to?
Yeah, hi, Dana. Well,
Hi,
what can one say?
welcome.
From what I've been reading, it was a horrific disappointment, especially for the indigenous population, not just Amazonia, but you had that flotilla from with indigenous peoples from all over the world who joined, and what's coming out is that there was no recognition of what these fossil fuel companies and extraction industry are doing to the indigenous population. And so my question to Sam and Larry is, did you get a feeling from other attendees who are not indigenous that there was any concern for the lack of representation at the table of the indigenous population because of the impact on their sovereign rights, their land, of all of these activities globally? Was there any sense that anybody gave a bloody damn?
I mean, I guess it's a question of who at the conference, because most of the side events you attended would at least reference indigenous people or even represent the historical underrepresentation, whether that was, you know, take into account at the heart of the negotiations is, I think, something I can't really speak on behalf of how it was factored into the actual decision making. I think we'll probably read more about that in the coming days. I haven't had time to read the Carbon Brave write up this morning, so I mean, it was mentioned. It was one of the common storylines throughout the COP. I think not being a negotiator, it's a little hard to say, like in the actual decision-making rooms, how was it referenced, where was it referenced, who was referenced. I think I can't really speak on behalf of that, but I think in terms of the general side events, the overall storyline of the COP, it was fairly dominant, I would say.
But if it was dominant, how can the words fossil fuel and the issue of deforestation be so underrepresented if their voice was dominant?
Well, side events are organized by anyone. Any NGO can submit a request to be able to organize a side event, and then they'll be assigned a room on a specific date at a specific time. And so, as Sam mentioned, many of those events did address the concerns of the plight of the indigenous people. I also tried, whenever I see a protest action, because those are authorized under some restrictions within the blue zone. So at specific designated locations at a specific time, you can organize a protest, which can be quite loud and quite angry. So I witnessed several of those. But the negotiators in their private rooms are perfectly free to ignore anything that goes on in the hallways or at the side events. So that's just the way it is.
I mean, at the end of the day, it's the fossil fuel producing countries. I mean, it's a consensus-based system, so you can have all the momentum from civil society, from indigenous peoples and local communities. At the end of the day, if certain fossil fuel producers do not want that included, there's not really a path forward. I mean, I mean, there's benefits and drawbacks to a consensus-based model, and I think we're seeing where the shortcomings lie. I think that was really clearly articulated in COP when you had the European Union and several Latin American countries, I think most notably, Colombia and Panama really pushing for transformational change at the end. But all the pushing, everything just didn't end up coming to fruition because of the fossil fuel blockers have historically blocked progress. And even if the US is gone, there's still plenty of other countries that are willing and able to obstruct. So I mean, I think to see the short, I think more clearly than other COPs, especially the US being out and that narrative being gone. I think it was really clear that there's some nations that want to push for actually transition away from fossil fuels, and some countries that are committed to doubling down, and that's the reality of the COP model at the moment.
Some,
But what was,
sorry, previously it's
yeah,
been some ways, even when it's been in petrostates, with the US presence, they've been able to help bend their perspective and bring them to the table. But it seems now with the US not there, the petrostates can just, say and do what they want. But I also want to comment on the place and cost and lack of facilities at Belém this year, which seem to have greatly limited the amount of civil society organizations which were able to participate. It was so remote. They didn't have the hotel rooms that were necessary or the low-cost hotel rooms. They had big cruise ships coming in that housed people, but the cruise ships were exorbitantly expensive. Most normal NGO workers and civil society organization participants weren't really able to participate and show give their input this year at the same extent that they have been in other COPs. We're going to go back to Nicholas in a minute, but just want to get your feedback. Is that off base, or did you feel like, oh, wow, participation was equal this
Well,
year?
it did have the second highest attendance of any cup in history, if I think correct. So, I mean, were the costs prohibitive? They were prohibitive, but I do think that at least the fact that it was the second highest attended cup does dispel some of that, even if I mean, everything was more difficult than normal. It would have been much easier if it was held in Sao Paulo or Rio or even Brasilia. So I mean, there is plenty of evidence to support that, but I would say that the second highest attendance model does dispel some of the concerns.
Hmm, okay.
yeah,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Sorry.
no, just to say, I mean, I spent most of the time in COP in a school that had been converted to a hostel with bunk beds. So that was the cheapest accommodation that I could find. But I think there was just this period of sort of speculation where the prices just went crazy. But then after that, I think they came back down as it was just supply and demand. More people were willing to rent out their own apartments, and so I know someone who was able to get an Airbnb at quite a reasonable price because he waited and didn't book when the prices were sky high.
Nicholas has been waiting with his hand up. Nicholas, would you like to unmute and
Yes, hopefully you can hear me all right. I think you probably just alluded to it, but I was just wondering, was there any sort of discussion on how to navigate the wave of far-right governments we're seeing? Especially, I mean, we just discussed the US not being there, but also we're seeing a bunch of right-wing governments in Europe as well that are pushing back on sustainability and also climate-related policies. I was just wondering, was there any discussion of that and maybe how countries and organizations are trying to achieve climate goals when that's all going on?
Um, I don't think that a side event specifically on that topic with something like that in the title would be approved because the UNFCCC tries to be non-political, and so you're not
Mm,
supposed to criticize any specific country government, but more informally within the um, well, the discussions, the Q&A during some of the events, clearly that was raised, but nothing formally, I would say.
Yeah,
I would
it's not. And then if I mean, I was mainly attending events tied to the work I was doing, which wouldn't have discussed those topics, but I think any of those.
Mm.
It's true that with the influence of the United States and with negotiating the tariffs and our security, that so many of the governments in Europe are bending to the will of Trump, which is tragic. I know in Finland, where I live, and many other normally progressive governments are caught between a rock and a hard place.
Hmm.
Karen Sudmeyer has a question.
Yes, hi, greetings to everybody from France. Actually, I'm living outside of Switzerland. I missed the first couple of minutes of this call, so you may have already covered this, but what do you think the real implications are of the US not being there officially for the next steps of the negotiations or for the next steps of climate discussions? And also how were I guess 100 governors and mayors attended, right, from the US. And I know that Gavin Newsom had quite a speech.
I'll play you a clip of it in just a minute.
How was that received? Thank you.
We don't have a seat at the negotiating table, but California and local and states will continue to lead by doing and by creating local policy. Of course, the Trump administration has been able to roll back a lot of the investment with the Inflation Reduction Act, but there is still more that we can do, I think, from a local level in the United States and from a state level. You've got states that are making agreements with countries and showing by example, creating the technologies, implementing the policies which can lead the way in the United States and across the world. But I think everybody's holding their breath until we get a new government installed and we go back to the process. What do you all think?
I think my understanding from at least reading is, at least when you have like an Obama type figure in charge that's leading and countries feel more compelled to act. And if you don't have that role being played in this COP, then countries will be less compelled to fall in line. I mean, I think it can go both ways with the US, but the US is derailing something. If it's derailing the loss and damage negotiations, it can go both ways. But I think in terms of when there is momentum, when there is consensus building, having strong US leadership could lead to positive change, and weak leadership can lead to weak change. And no leadership would, allow countries to act more freely. So if their interests are produced in fossil fuels, then and I think you saw some of that because you between COP28 when there was the mention of fossil fuels and now we are COP30 and now the mentions of fossil fuels are being taken out. So what's the difference here? And I think the most common denominator is the US was in there under a democratic leadership and now that they're not.
Exactly. John Kerry that year in Dubai just worked through the night to achieve this and really did something extraordinary. And without US leadership, the petrostates have more sway. But I do want to just play a clip of Gavin Newsom's speech. I think he was the highest level participant at COP. I know that some of you saw Senator Whitehouse speak, but I do want to just share with you. Let me share my screen.
Yeah, 9 out of 10 cases will add a 100%, 100% clean energy. And that's because of our very intentional policies that are nation leading, including cap and invest program that we just extended to 2045. So I point that as an aspect of contrast to what's going on in Washington, D.C. I don't want that to shape your perception of my country. We also recognize that climate risk is also financial risk. And increasingly, we are struggling as a nation with home building and access to mortgages because of the insurance crisis that has been induced and exacerbated because of climate change. I say that to reinforce the economic imperative to address from a cost of living perspective the importance of changing the way we produce and consume energy. Final point. I'm not naive about the biggest competitor in the United States of America. And I say this not with a closed fist, on my eyes wide open. Because in America, respect that China is doing at scale as it relates to supply chains and manufacturing. And the United States of America better wake up to that. Our legacy automobile manufacturers better wake up to that. This is not about electric power. This is about economic power. And we in the state of California are not going to cede that race to China. We're going to compete in that market. And I think one of the great applications, final point, is the own goal of the President of the United States, who simply doesn't understand how enthusiastic President Xi is today, that the Trump administration is nowhere to be found at COP30 today. Thank you.
Thoughts, reflections, and then I think Sally has a question. How was the Chinese presence? I understand they gave out a lot. I know that the pavilion was full, Chinese pavilion was full last year with painting and party favors and a huge, overwhelming presence there. They're the highest emitters along with the United States. Did they make positive input into the negotiations? Are they putting up money for the adaptation fund? Are they all talk and no action? What was your impression this year?
I think it's important to mention. I think the Guardian article that Chinese emissions have been flat or falling for the last 18 months. So the Chinese are reaching peak emissions. And then also I would say of like the BRICS countries, I felt like they were probably the least vocal of the countries. I mean, in the final plenary, the Russian delegation was calling Colombia and the Latin American countries a bunch of children and insulting them. You should watch the clip. It's pretty spectacular television. But I think of the BRICS countries, they seem to be the quietest. I think they are leading by example in many ways, even if they're not necessarily pledging, tons of finance. So I don't know. I mean, I think I don't know. I think like Newsom's speech trying to, attack President Xi rather than try to force like bilateral cooperation between the US and Chinese for emissions reductions. It doesn't seem like it's that strategic to me, but I don't know. That's my take.
Larry,
Yeah.
he seems to have frozen.
Yeah. So China did indeed have a huge pavilion, very prominent. Always lots of people there giving away little stuffed pandas. I got one. I don't know. I don't know what they were doing in the negotiations because I'm not privy to that. But I know that there's always recurring criticism of the fact that China is somehow lumped together with the so-called G77 developing countries. They call it G77 plus China. And I was just trying to find in my notes that I'd written down something that someone said
But the truth is that we are producing at scale solar panels, technology for renewable energy, which is so important. Whether they're outproducing us or not, the important thing is that whatever they're producing is not ultimately is reducing fossil fuel emissions both in China and elsewhere in the world. And they do have very serious commitment to reducing emissions within their own country. And they have the means because they're, for better or worse, an autocratic government. They can force the issue. No combustible engines in cities.
I think just like in aggregate, the BRICS countries felt more powerful than I've ever felt them, even if like the Chinese presence, because they weren't the most outspoken, at least publicly. And like everything that I've heard, they were not maybe not the most principal blockers, I would say. But I would say that in general, the BRICS narrative was quite strong. And then I also felt like at least a lot of civil society organizations are constantly just pushing like a global north versus global south narrative, and that kind of just sets the whole BRICS parties aside. And it's just creating this dichotomy that leaves out this like huge block of power of people. And I think that's at least from my perspective that I think some of the civil society discussions felt a little obsolete at this point because they're trying to push a narrative with the US being out and BRICS being super powerful, that it's like, oh well, it's the EU and the UK versus all these global South countries. And that's it's not, it's that narrative still exists, especially when you talk about loss and damage or certain types of or adaptation-based finance. So I mean that does exist, but at the same time, I feel like there's like missing the forest for the trees at times as well.
Sally has been waiting patiently to ask a question, and Belinda, yes, I want a BYD car. I think they're awesome too. Sally, would you like to?
Thanks, Dana. It's good seeing all of you. You've already discussed, one of my questions was what was the official absence of the official US government? How did that weigh in? But I think that's been discussed a bit. My second question is, was there any talk, not officially, but in the corridors, about the treaty that was going to be signed concerning the transportation of petroleum products by boat? There was a treaty that was international treaty that was going to require a number of safety measures to avoid spills and environmental disasters. And the U.S. president, I don't like to use his name, but the U.S. president and his honchos or minions, as it were, in state went after 48 countries who had indicated a willingness to sign and threatened them with the refusal to give them visas to come to the United States, et cetera, and they backed off. So my question is that totally dead? Was there any talk about it, which is a huge environmental problem? And I also wanted to alert all of you to the EU's status, what's going on with the Green Climate Plan at the EU. There was a absolutely terrific directive, which was voted by the EU on the due diligence requirement of suppliers regarding their human rights and environmental protection. and they've pretty much watered it down to something called the omnibus, which is still being negotiated, but the environmental part of it, as well as the very good part of the protection for human rights, has been exceedingly watered down, in my own opinion. Most human rights activists believe that as well. So I don't think we're moving in a good direction. If anyone feels a little bit more optimistic, and I appreciate the optimism that I heard early in this call, it's hard to hold on to anything, but it's good to hear. Was there any talk about this treaty? I know it's difficult to say because everyone was in different rooms at different times, but I'd be interested in your impressions of has it died a fast death, or is it just very sick? Thank you.
So yeah, so that was at the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, where the US was present, and as you said, their delegates were going around really, blackmailing delegates from other countries, and as a result of that, it was postponed for 1 year, I think. Or I mean, not the treaty itself, but the decision to vote on it or to approve it has been postponed.
Well, that's
now
good news.
I
Maybe.
don't recall any. There may have been an event, a side event on it, or maybe there was a pavilion dedicated to that. But what I do recall is that there was a speech by Laurence Toubiana, who was a French,
Yeah,
politician.
we know her.
Yeah,
We knew her well when she
architect,
was justice minister.
and she was an architect of the Paris Agreement, and she's now the president of the European Climate Foundation, which is quite a big foundation funding climate projects. And so I was really surprised to hear her say this in the speech, and I think it was really worth further investigation, is that she said that the US was putting pressure, and my understanding was that she meant at COP, she was not referring back to the IMO, on some parties at the COP, and she specifically mentioned Kenya and Barbados. And so, I mean, if that's true, I think that should be really, revealed and denounced and exposed. So, but that's the only, information that I had about what the U.S. might have been doing at the COP.
Thank you, Larry.
In terms of interfering and subverting the process.
Yeah, hard to say, but thank you. Thank you for that hopeful. I am now hopeful that the treaty will come back next year. It's not terminally dead. Thank you.
We may have to wait 3 years until Trump is out of office.
Treaties take forever, but as long as it's moving forward a little bit, maybe it's sleeping right now, but they haven't killed it entirely from what you say.
I don't think the treaties ever die completely if they're not signed. The plastics treaty also, again failed, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be abandoned. I think we continue to work on them. That's surprising about Barbados with Motley as, at the helm there. Very surprising, Larry.
Yeah, I that's all I know, and I really made a mental note that I should try to investigate that and find out if there was truth to that, or if I misunderstood her and she was referring to the IMO meeting.
Thank you for the thoughtful question, Sally. Sally is obviously a legal expert, an attorney, long serving in France, and is on top of these issues. I see that Naomi again has her hand up for a question. We'd love to hear from you.
Thank you, Dana. So, what I'm curious about is, especially given your sharing this information about how the U.S., which didn't attend, but obviously worked the system and in undermining things. Are there other impediments that we know of where fossil fuel lobbyists are using finance to buy off
Really hate
leaders
that.
of certain countries, of other influences who are undermining good decisions? Is there any way of encouraging investigation of this kind of maneuvering that is undermining progress?
Well, at every COP, there's a report on the number of fossil fuel lobbyists present. And this year they counted 1,600, which I think is an increase over COP29, where it was 1,400. Personally, I take that with a bit of a grain of salt because I think they use a very broad definition of fossil fuel lobbyists. So, for example, last year they counted among the Belgian lobbyists a senior executive from the Belgian Enterprise Federation. It's sort of like the Belgian Chamber of Commerce. Why? Because the fossil fuel company Total Energy is a member. But of course, practically every company, every big company in Belgium is a member. So I think it's not, yeah, it's a bit unfair to just assume that that person is then defending the interests of specifically the fossil fuel industry. But anyway, that is a recurring complaint about their presence, and some people are calling for them to be kicked out altogether, others for greater transparency so that at least we know who is there and what interests they represent, because anybody can get a badge. So I go there as an observer, as a delegate of what is called an observer NGO, which is the Press Club Brussels Europe, even though I'm not an employee of the Press Club. And if I have a spare badge, which someone from the Press Club is not using, I can simply give it to someone else. And I've received a lot of requests for a spare badge, and I gave them away for specific days. But then that person is going around the halls wearing a badge that says Press Club Brussels Europe. So of course I try to be careful, who I give them to. But whether it's someone wearing someone else's a badge from another organization, or what they call party overflow, that's a badge that countries can give to people who are not actually part of the negotiating team, are not government officials, but are simply part of the delegation accompanying either from NGOs or from businesses. And so then you just see the name and party overflow, and they could very well be working for Shell or BP or Exxon or whatever.
I have to go back to this issue of the fossil fuel lobbyists and these COPs being held in petrostates. If we go back to Dubai, COP28, and people were so outraged that there were all these Saudi sheiks and oil barons running around, and even the president of the COP. But in a way, of course, it was a strong U.S. presence. There was John Kerry leading the negotiations, and they were forced to listen. All the lobbyists and all the representatives from the petrostates were forced to listen and to see the protest and to listen to the arguments and the science of how their industries were degrading, the future of our planet. And they were because they were in the position of the presidency, they were put in a position where they were kind of forced, they were shamed into negotiating a really tangible, successful outcome to the COP. So it can work, in to our benefit. I think in that year it did work to our benefit. It was pretty remarkable to see.
But Dana, what I was getting at was not so much the obvious industry lobbyists, but industry insiders
Right.
that are manipulating from the inside. I mean, look at New York State DEC, the Department of Environmental Conservation. Given my involvement with them in running programs that they partnered in, you know that they're loaded with industry insiders, and you can see the fingerprints in the decisions that are being made by the different departments. Well, who are the industry insiders in these different countries that are actually blocking any progress in moving the disconnect from fossil fuels forward? That's really the transparency that's needed in this.
But it's a messy project.
Ugh.
It's very messy with but it's
Added
not
to the US debacle, and you just
it's very messy and very frustrating and disappointing. But it's not a bad thing to have all the voices at the table. I can remember sitting, was it in Dubai or Baku? Last minute negotiations. It was the middle of the night, and we're sitting with some journalists and some negotiators, and I was just like, oh, how are you? We were all disappointed. Most of us were disappointed because there wasn't stronger language about fossil fuels. And then I asked this one guy who was sitting with us, well, asking him, what do you think? And he said, yeah, I'm very disappointed. And I said, tell me more. And he said, I'm disappointed because the language about fossil fuels is too strong. I represent Iraq, and every drop of oil that we sell saves a baby's life. It's not what I wanted to hear, but it was very interesting to sit, as a young man who is negotiating in earnest, that has a real perspective on the day-to-day livelihood and struggles of his constituencies. It's so important that people are able, from every walk of life, from every political persuasion and perspective, to be able to listen to each other, to sit down and to discuss, and maybe for a second have part of your mind changed, or at least to develop more empathy. It's a real value to these global gatherings, I believe. But yes, there are a lot of fossil fuel insiders and lobbyists. There was a fantastic play, which will be coming to the United States now, to Broadway, which was playing on the West End, called Kyoto. I had the privilege of going to see it last spring, which traces the evolution of the Kyoto Protocol on all the COPs, and based upon one fossil fuel industry insider who was brilliantly played in the play. And it's staged like one of the COPs on a round table. And it talks about how the industry has impacted and tried to thwart this process for decades and decades. But we can't let it die. What alternative do we have than to join together to face this existential threat that our planet is at the brink of? What alternative do we have? So hopefully, when we take back Congress in a big blue wave, in 2026 and gear up to take back the White House and the Senate in 2028, we will again have a more powerful position at the international. A tsunami, yes, which brings me to where the end of November, January 15th, Angela reminded you, is International Voting Registration Day. How we vote impacts our planet. Please, every calendar year, you must register to vote. Go to votefromabroad.org. Make sure you're registered. Join the global push on International Voter Registration Day on January 15th. Yes, we need to get out the vote because what we do here matters. It matters for the planet. It matters for our communities. Does somebody have more questions? Sam had to step away. He was limited today in our time, but Larry is still waiting at the airport for his connecting flight, and we're happy to entertain more questions about the COP this year. Except he just went sideways. Hello, Larry. Yeah, please put star hand up in the chat. I want to ask you, I know you have a little video of it, Larry, because you were sharing it. You were right next to the fire, a big fire. Not only is the planet on fire and the COP full of controversy, but the blue zone caught fire. And I think nobody was killed. There was some exhaust inhalation, but tell us about the fire. It was in the African pavilion? Larry, did you hear my question?
He's on mute.
Yes, sorry, I'm having trouble. I absolutely did witness it. I was sitting on a bench at sort of a major sort of intersection of the hallways where all these pavilions are, and all of a sudden I see these people running towards me, and I just figured at first, oh well, there must be some celebrity that had just arrived and they want to go and take a selfie, or maybe there's some sort of a giveaway. And then all of a sudden, I caught sight of the flames, and it was really, really impressive. I mean, the flames were just shooting right up to the roof of this big tent, because most of the pavilions were under a huge tent that had just been erected, temporarily for the COP, and so that you could just see that this entire pavilion was ablaze, and I really feared that it would spread. And fortunately, I guess the tent material must not be flammable, because it seemed to sort of stay more or less contained. So the whatever paneling and furniture and whatever carpet or something in the pavilion was on fire, and it just burned a hole through the roof. But then it eventually was brought under control, although some people pointed out that there was no sprinkler system. There was just individuals running up with sort of handheld fire extinguishers, which seemed kind of inadequate. But eventually it was brought under control. The unfortunate thing is that this happened at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and they evacuated everybody from the entire blue zone, including areas that were really not at all impacted by the fire. And so all the events and everything that were planned that afternoon, including a press conference that I had scheduled, that I was supposed to host, were canceled, and obviously could not be caught up, because the following day they reopened the blue zone in the morning, but then there was already a full schedule for that day. So unfortunately, a lot of those events. Oh, and also all the pavilions remained closed. So each country pavilion typically has its own program of events, conferences, etc. And so they all those were canceled. So that was really very unfortunate. And I still don't know what actually caused the fire, whether it was an electrical short circuit or maybe it was the coffee machine or I don't know.
Because at these pavilions, often they're giving out coffee and it could have been but it was in the African pavilion, and the news seemed to spread as a symbol of the COP, that it was on between the protests, because there were violent protests from indigenous people who broke into the blue zone. They had to be suppressed by the police and escorted out, and that this was the symbol of the Belém COP was the fire. I guess you tell us about Senator Whitehouse. I don't think Senator Markey came this year, which might have been the first year in 15 years that Senator Markey hasn't attended, which is surprising. But Senator Whitehouse again attended. And tell me, I know you did manage to take that in. Larry, tell us about Senator Whitehouse's address.
No, maybe that was Sam, maybe, because unfortunately I did not. But what I can tell you is about a Latino woman who is a state representative of New Mexico.
Oh, yes.
And I heard her speak twice. And she opened her talk by saying, this is something I didn't realize, we are the second biggest oil and gas producer in the United States.
Next to Texas.
After Texas. Yeah. So, when she said that, I was like kind of groaning, and thinking, okay, well, what is she going to say to make up for that? But the interesting thing is that they have had the foresight over the years to set up a sovereign wealth fund, just like Norway has this absolutely gigantic fund of $1 trillion or whatever, trillion euros or whatever. But the New Mexico sovereign fund is 68 billion, and it's going to be entirely dedicated to the transition. So they realize that the days of fossil fuel extraction are numbered, and they are planning for a just transition where they will be able to reskill the oil and gas workers. And so that I was really impressed by that. So that at least shows long range thinking and planning.
Under the leadership of the wonderful governor of New Mexico, who joined us in Costa Rica at the Democrats Abroad convention. They see the problems and the challenges very clearly, and she has really led the country with great aplomb and foresight. She is excellent. But yes, they are
this representative. I spoke to her, and she said that they're also trying to limit methane emissions from the oil wells, including the sort of what they call the orphan wells. These are wells that have been abandoned and where the owner has sort of.
This is a law which was enacted with the Inflation Reduction Act, which was the methane provision last year, 2 years ago. And this was a very important law that Biden wrote in to address the issue of orphan wells and flaring in the oil industry. But now the Trump administration has rolled back all of that. unfortunately. But glad to hear that New Mexico is complying. Texas is actually trying to comply because they know it's in their economic interest and it's in the interest of the health of their communities. But the Trump administration has rolled back those requirements, unfortunately. So let's talk about, we have a couple of minutes remaining. This is the venue for COP32 was actually voted on before the venue for COP31. So in 2027, COP will be held in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. And we have now learned at the very end of this conference that COP will be, finally, there was a dispute, big competition between Turkey and Australia. Many people wanted it to be in Australia because the Pacific Islands would be represented, but Turkey gave up their rights in 2020 to Glasgow with the promise that the next time it came to their region that they would again have those rights, and they were sticking to their guns. They weren't going to give it up again. So it will be held in Turkey, in Antalya, but the presidency will be held by Australia. So that is quite interesting. But it's not the first year that the geographical location and the presidency are split. Maybe not a bad thing. Any thoughts, Larry? This was last minute decision.
Yes, and the interesting thing is that the Australia and the Turkey pavilion were side by side. And so when I saw that, I thought, well, whoever, is in charge of assigning pavilions must have a sense of humor. But then it was explained that it was more, the reason was that the pavilions needed to be close to the presidency, because obviously there was sort of shuttling back and forth to try to come to an agreement. Whatever the reason, it was just kind of funny to see that. And if I had put my money, I really thought that Australia would win, and my guess was that Turkey would get some concession in return. And I just thought that Erdogan was kind of transactional like Trump and would just hold out until he managed to get something else in return. But I'm obviously, in terms of distance, I'm quite relieved that it's going to be in Turkey, because I did finally decide to make the trip to Brazil, but I really don't think I would have flown to Australia.
Australia is a long way, but so is Belém in Brazil, a very long way. And the nice thing about having it in Antalya is there's a huge infrastructure of hotels and Airbnbs, and it's affordable and it's an easy place to get to. And maybe it's the best of both worlds, because Australia, which now does have a climate-friendly government, will be holding the presidency. So maybe there are some benefits to this arrangement. And we all look forward to seeing you perhaps more often. In previous years, we have reported almost daily from the COP venue, and we hope to resume that participation next year with COP31. But it's been great to have you here for our roundup this year, and we look forward to discussing our progress and challenges next year as well. But thank you for joining us. Does anybody have any final questions before we adjourn? No. Okay. So see you next year. Let's hope that we can make global progress with the plastics treaty, with the maritime treaty, with biodiversity, with climate adaptivity and with the roadmap to transitioning away from fossil fuels throughout the year, not just during these important UN climate conferences. So with that, I'll wish you a farewell and make sure you register to vote on January 15th and join us for the festivities with Democrats Abroad during that week.